up for. John, how do you do, sir?
I am doing much better than, say, the Japanese stock market right now, Mike.
No one's ever told me that as their answer. I've got a lot of answers to that question. That one has never been it. Tell me about the Japanese stock market.
Sure. Obviously, overnight our time during their trading day, the Japanese stock market fell close to 13%, their major index, in a single day, which is the worst in decades. If you go back to the last 3 days, they're down like almost 19%. So in other words, a huge crash in the Japanese stock market. There's nothing that's happened in the Japanese economy that would signal this. This looks like a kind of reaction to perhaps a global economic slowdown and certainly a slowdown in the U.S. And a sort of unwinding in a lot of trades that have been happening around the U.S. dollar and the Japanese yen. But basically, this is something that happened in the Japanese stock market, but it is reflective of a newly perceived weakness in the U.S. economy.
Well, let's maybe we can get back around to the American stock market, but you have an article here. U.S. economy added just 114,000 jobs in July. What are we supposed to do with that number?
So, look, 114,000 is not a terrible number. In a lot of times in our economy, that would have been just fine. The problem is it was a much worse than expected number, which told people, oh, wait, maybe the economy is actually doing worse than we thought it was. So people were expecting around 180,000. So that's a big gap between what we actually got and what people were expecting. The other problem is that the unemployment rate has been going up pretty rapidly. It's low by historical standards, but a lot of times what matters in the economy and in markets is the direction of change and the rate of change. So what we've gone is pretty rapidly from what was a 3.8% unemployment rate all the way up to a 4.3%. This rapid shift is a recession signal. It's not just a signal that a recession is coming, but every time you have seen a 50 basis point shift in the 3-month moving average from the lowest 12-month, 3-month moving average, you have been in a recession. In other words, not that a recession is coming, but that you are already in one. This doesn't feel like an economy that's in a recession. Again, the unemployment rate is only 4.3%, but it has a lot of people worried that either we're in one or close to one.
Tell me the latest with inflation. We were just talking a moment ago about the Denny's Lumberjack Slam for $17.
Yeah.
So you go get some eggs and toast and ham and bacon and you're out $20. Easy.
College me is weeping. I mean, that was like, where we went. I just, we wouldn't be able to afford it. We'd have to split it 4 ways. This is so we've had a lot of inflation. And the economy is still staggering from it. Now, inflation has come down a lot from the worst days when it was running at a 9% rate in the middle of 2022. But even with inflation having come down, we're still at around 2.5% to 3%, which is almost double what we were around before the pandemic hit. It is still very high, and it's above the Fed's target. If we're hitting a recession while inflation is still high, that's really troubling because the Fed is going to have to cut rates. That could have the danger of actually increasing inflation while we're trying to rescue the economy from rapidly falling off a cliff. You don't want those two things. It's a reason why you always want inflation to be under control, because if you let it get high and then you run into an economic emergency, you're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Do you know Scott Bessent?
Of course. He's one of the most brilliant economic minds we have around right now.
Never heard of the guy. So he may be a Treasury Secretary pick for Trump?
Is that possible? God willing, that would be a terrific selection for Donald Trump. Scott not just understands, the economy and international finance. He's actually also an expert in Japanese economics. But also he understands trade, tariffs, and what I will call like Trumponomics very well, better than almost anybody else out there. I think if Trump was lucky enough to have him, that would be a great choice for Treasury Secretary.
Wow, I'm reading his bio here. He's on the Yale University Council. That seems.
But we won't hold that against him,
like
Mike.
It seems like they wouldn't want him on that council. But I bet he also has $1 billion, so that may be part of it too. Anyway, he made the fine point that if Joe Biden has not been the one running the White House, and I think we can all agree that, then surely it must be Kamala, right? So who was in charge during the border issue, if not her? But then this other question, she was the 50-50 tie-breaking vote on the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act.
That's right.
And I think it's a point Republicans need to hammer home. She wasn't just the vice president, had nothing to do with that. She was the 50-50 tie-breaking vote. This would not have happened if it weren't for her. So how did the Rescue Plan, the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act lead to a $20 lumberjack slam at Denny's?
Right. Well, so she was the tie-breaking vote. These, as you said, these things would not have happened without her. She was also one of the biggest public advocates for Bidenomics. And the problem with the American Rescue Plan was that it was...
She said those words, by the way. Just real quick, sorry to interrupt. She actually said those words, Bidenomics.
Yes.
And touted it.
She ran around loving to say Bidenomics. They tried to it was a term that, frankly, conservatives made up to attack the administration. They tried to then own it by saying, yes, we love Bidenomics. But it turned out that was a disaster because Bidenomics has been very bad. Everybody could see it. No matter how many times they tried to say it with a smile on their face, it didn't improve things. Kamala Harris voted for the American Rescue Plan. The American Rescue Plan was what I call the Democratic revenge plan. It was the economy was recovering before Joe Biden came into office. Actually, in the third and fourth quarter of 2020, when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were saying that the economy was in ruins, it was in recovery. It was in one of the most rapid recoveries we've ever experienced. And they couldn't, but they had run on the idea that Donald Trump had somehow destroyed the economy. Of course, that hadn't happened. But when they came into office, they felt that they needed to do something big in order to claim credit for the recovery. Now, what they should have done is just done something small and claim credit anyway. Then we might have gotten a little bit of inflation coming out of the pandemic, but we wouldn't have gotten the 40-year high inflation that we got. Instead, they went big. They spent $2 trillion right off the bat. They had plans to spend $10 trillion more. Fortunately, they didn't get to spend all of that. Their Build Back Better plans got pulled back to things like the Inflation Reduction Act, but that was still inflationary. They kept spending more money. When you pour money into an economy that is partially supply constrained, at the same time you're putting on more regulations, at the same time you're saying that you're going to end fossil fuel production within the next 10 years, that you're going to end the production of internal combustion engines. So you're putting all of these anti-growth positions in place while you're pouring in demand. Of course, you're going to drive inflation even higher. Kamala Harris cannot escape responsibility for that. She was right there at the center of it. This is Kamala inflation, and I don't think just like it was Biden inflation, and I think the voters are going to see that.
Well, that's really interesting. So that's another example of how COVID being the biggest, but there's many, of how they do the opposite of what Trump did and said always. They just had to do the opposite. That's
right. They ran on the idea that Donald Trump had ruined the economy. That was a lie. It's almost, like the story you tell your kids. When you start to tell one lie, it leads to another. They told the lie about Trump ruining the economy. Then they had to tell the lie about the economy needing trillions of dollars of stimulus to pump it up. Then they had to tell another lie about what had caused the inflation that resulted. So they've had to lie all the way through. And those chickens came home to roost in terms of inflation. And now, frankly, I think they're coming home to roost in terms of the recession that appears to be on the horizon, because they pumped up the economy so full of dollars that when they had to start pulling back, because frankly, everybody was looking at the debt piling up and getting worried, that actually was the last thing supporting the economy. And now we seem to be tumbling off a cliff.